Hey pirate fans around the world. This is Cartagena the siege, the gold, the hidden tunnels. Cartagena guarded Spain's American gold with genius walls, survived 3 epic assaults, and may still hide the arteries that kept its heart beating underground. Cartagena de Indias was the hinge of an empire, the gateway where fleets gathered, and the vault where bullion paused on its way to Europe. The city did not simply wear walls, it engineered a living shield of stone, water, and wind. Tonight the story moves quickly, a map in the mind to place each bastion and inlet. 3 assaults that tested the city like a storm. Tests a ship, 5086, 1697, 1741. The routes that brought gold and emeralds into its counting rooms. The difference between real countermine tunnels and the legends of secret escape routes. How the coastline itself behaved like a weapon, and a clear verdict about what is documented, what is doubtful, and what might still be hidden. The stakes are simple. Understand why Cartagena's survival reshaped pirate routes, imperial policy, and the very idea of treasure security across the Caribbean. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy and want to fall asleep with pirate stories whenever you want. The big question is direct, and the roadmap is calm. How did one port stand between privateers, pirates, and rival empires? And what do its sieges, its gold logistics, and its underground galleries reveal about the real Caribbean? The method is straightforward. First, a mental city map. Then a brisk chronology of attacks. Next, an engineering deep dive that anyone can follow. Then the treasure economy that made Cartagena a magnet. After that, the underground, what is a countermine and what is only a good story. And finally, a verdict. Along the way, quick comparisons to Portobello's trade fairs, to Havana's harbor shield, and to the freewheeling havens of Tortuga will show why Cartagena was different. Let's take it step by step. To find one's bearings, picture the bay first. At the mouth of that bay lie 2 throats. Boca Chica, the narrow southern entry, and Boca Grande, the shallow northern sweep that was once tricky and is now a sandbar-shifted story of its own. Past those throats, the water opens like a blue room. On the inner stage sits the walled city, its bastions and straight curtain walls tracing a defensive geometry older than the city's churches and just as deliberate. To one side, Getsamani busy, working full of docks and streets where ships' crews walked with rope burns on their hands and spices still in their clothes. Rising behind them all, the hill of San Lazaro holds a crown of stone, the fortress of San Felipe de Barajas, a low, strong mass that seems to grow out of the rock itself. Beyond, La Popa Hill carries a convent and a lookout, a natural observation tower that watches both sea and land. Across the water, out on Tierra Bomba Island, batteries such as San Jose and San Luis interlock their fields of fire with the city's guns, drawing crossing lines no attacker wants to test. That is the map. Each place has a purpose. The bastions protect the people and face the sea. San Felipe controls the landward approaches and the inner bay. La Popa sees an army coming before the army knows it has been seen. Boca Chica and Boca Grande act like doors that defenders can lock or leave ajar. The outer batteries warn the enemy that this bay is a trap with a polite smile. Why Cartagena mattered begins with the treasure circuit. Quick fact, the so-called Tierra Firme fleet was not a single ship, but an entire system, a convoy that combined the cargoes of empires into something larger than any galleon's hull. Silver from Potosi and gold from New Granada moved like rivers toward the sea, met at fairs in Portobello, then crossed to Cartagena's warehouses for registry, guarding and dispatch toward Havana, and finally Spain. The cargo list was mixed. Bullion, yes, but also cochineal dye, cacao, tobacco, timber, hides, spices, and practical goods that would be sold in Europe or turned back toward colonial needs. Emeralds added a special shine. They were light, valuable, and easy to hide, which made honest paperwork vital and smuggling tempting. In that braid of legal and illicit markets, Cartagena became more than a dot on a map. It became a target whose capture could shake treasury books across an ocean. Rival empires understood this. So did privateers who measured profit by risk and time. Taking Cartagena, or even scaring it, might open a vault without picking a lock. Here the mind can hold 3 snapshots that will guide the hour. In 1586, Francis Drake arrived not as a whisper, but as a trumpet, demanding ransom with the speed of a thief who knows that delay is danger. In 1697, Baron de Pointes came with French royal power and hired buccaneers, a combination that did not walk well together, but walked hard enough to hurt. In 1741, Admiral Edward Vernon brought a vast British armada to the doorstep and found a smaller, smarter defense waiting behind heat, earthworks, and disease. Keep a listening goal: which tactics worked, which failed, and how each attack rewired the city's defenses. Heads up on this: those underground spaces will not wait until the end. The tunnels matter in the first 10 minutes, because they were not escape routes for romance. They were ears and teeth in the hillside. Countermine galleries existed to hear enemy sappers scraping their way toward the walls, to flood those saps with water, or to break them with powder. Legends of secret exits across half a mile of seabed make good tavern talk, but the real underground is smarter, closer, and more practical. Now the clock turns back to 5086, to a port that had not yet been bound in the stone geometry visitors admire today. The Elizabethan world trained captains like Francis Drake to live on speed and surprise. When he appeared, he acted quickly, landing, striking, creating panic, and making the calculus of ransom feel superior to the calculus of battle. The city's defenses at that time were patchwork, not yet hardened by later engineering, and weak points opened like windows in a storm. Ransom, in plain terms, was protection money paid in a hurry to save lives, buildings, and cargo. Drake took what he demanded and more: prestige from a blow landed in full daylight and notes for future attackers about where the city's reactions were slow. His raid became a classroom for Cartagena. The aftermath was not sulking, but a sweep of emergency fortification programs, stone, earth, and plans on paper that turned lessons into thicker walls, wider angles, and watchful outworks. The raid's shame was practical fuel for resilience. The second snapshot is heavier. 1697, when Baron de Pointes of France arrived with royal backing, and importantly, with buccaneers whose job description made officers nervous. The French strategy took shape in steps any listener can follow: force landings, seize heights, batter the town, and tear its wealth loose. Warehouses and the homes of the elite suffered first, as invaders sought both money and leverage. Inside the attacking force, tension grew between naval officers who wanted order and buccaneers who wanted reward. The sack cut deep into Cartagena's pride, and into family fortunes that had expected protection. But pain tends to teach, and the lesson pushed the city's defensive investments outward toward the bay's mouth. If an enemy could be stopped at the door, the house would not need to fight in the hallway. Policies hardened as well. The civic and colonial governments learned to see privateers not as useful tools, but as risks that arrived smiling. The third snapshot is the longest because 741 was a test that became a legend. Admiral Vernon's armada was immense, a floating city with more masts than some observers had seen in a lifetime. The Spanish command, leaner, more experienced at fighting from the ground it knew, staged the defense like a chess problem. Outer works at Boca Chica, inner faith in San Felipe's slopes and walls, night movements, artillery positions measured as if every cannonball were a coin that could not be wasted. The British plan depended on big numbers doing big work. The defenders relied on turning numbers into liabilities. Disease crept through the attackers' ranks. Heat and humidity dragged on muscles. The escalades against San Felipe, in which ladders carried hope up a steep face of stone and fire, faltered in the dark when trenches and outworks forced attacking columns to bunch and break. A smaller force held when the larger force could not drive its narrow advantages through narrow places. The result echoed across Europe. It changed careers, speeches in parliament, and sea stories in taverns where maps hung on walls. To understand why those results made sense, the camera can drift in close on the walls themselves. A bastion is a pointed projection from a wall, like a stone shoulder. Its geometry is not fancy, it is logical. Two bastions look out, and more importantly, look sideways to cover each other, creating overlapping fields of fire that make any attacker feel watched from two angles at once. Straight stretches between bastions, the curtains open, killing zones. Outside those walls, hornworks and ravelins add thin noses of earth and stone, shapes that break up an enemy's approach and force him to expose his profile again and again. Across the channels, heavy chains and booms block ships like a low fence stops a running child, not by strength alone, but by making the path awkward and predictable under fire. Batteries at San Jose and San Luis on Tierra Bamba Island interlock with the city's guns, the way fingers interlace, so that a ship trying to dodge one set of cannon stumbles into the next. Each crisis taught the engineers something, and each fix became a teacher for the next generation. Cartagena turned itself into a school where the lessons were written in stone, water, and the memory of noise. Boca Chica and Boca Grande deserved gentle attention, because they were not just names, they were decisions. The sea kept changing. Boca Chica was the narrow southern throat, the door the city preferred to control with batteries, chains, and geometry. Boca Grande was a northern sweep complicated by sandbars that shifted under storms and seasons. When Boca Grande shallowed, heavy ships could not force it. When channels shifted, pilots who knew the lines of depth became as valuable as soldiers with medals. Closing or controlling one throat forced attackers into a funnel where anyone could count their masts and read their intentions. Over decades, coastal change acted like an ally. Nature did some of the work and demanded some of the planning, an exchange less romantic than an ambush but more effective than a boast. Inside the hill at San Felipe lies what this story promised early: the underground. A countermine is a defender's tunnel designed to find and defeat an attacker's tunnel. Imagine a web of low galleries carved through rock and packed earth, with small listening shafts like narrow chimneys rising to the surface or to protected vents, and with bulb-shaped chambers where powder could be set. When an attacking army began to sap toward the walls, digging zigzag trenches above and tunnels below, the defenders had to hear it. Sound travels well through earth, and an experienced miner could tell the difference between natural noises and the regular scrape of tools. Once detected, an enemy sap could be flooded with water if the defenders reached it first, or broken open with a small explosion that collapsed the tunnel and scared the men inside without creating a crater that hurt the fortress. In some sieges around the world, tunnelers fought underground with pistols and knives in tight darkness. At Cartagena, the galleries were deterrence and discovery tools as much as they were weapons. In those tight corridors, sound became a weapon and silence became relief. That is the real function. It is smaller than legend, but more impressive than myth. The legends, however, live their own flexible lives. Listeners have heard them in ports from Cadiz to Veracruz, cloisters with quiet corridors that lead under streets to docks, noble houses with sea exits used by merchants at night, cisterns that open into passageways, even whispers of tunnels running beneath the bay itself to islets where a boat could be launched in secret. For Cartagena, the inventory of stories fills a friendly evening. Some mention a convent door that opens to a cool descent. Others talk about a warehouse whose floor gives way to a narrow stair leading toward a quay. Architectural surveys in modern times have indeed found substructures, water channels, storage rooms, short passages used to move goods out of the sun. Colonial records sometimes mention access routes designed to keep cargo away from crowded streets. Oral tradition adds color with every retelling. The judgment can be simple and fair. Some underground spaces are documented stone and brick. A few are plausible shortcuts between surface points that make commercial sense. The mile-long escape route to the open sea remains a legend best enjoyed with a smile. The gold itself and the paperwork around it deserve a long, easy look, because this is where many viewers lean closer to the screen. The Cajayo Whale The Royal Treasury Office handled counting, weighing, and sealing. Guards walked predictable routes, and sometimes that predictability created danger. Convoys had schedules, because seasons have winds and the Caribbean has hurricanes that do not read memos. Emergency dispersal plans existed for moments when threat was serious. Move bullion in small packets to safer rooms, load a portion onto a fast escort, or hide a cache within the city's thick-walled buildings under officer control. Emeralds required special care. Stones had to be evaluated, stamped, and recorded with a rigor that annoyed impatient traders and thwarted common frauds. Shrinkage, the gentle name for goods that mysteriously go missing, was fought with seals, double-entry bookkeeping, and surprise inspection. The city learned to break patterns when patterns became traps. A convoy that formed on a different day, a registry office that stayed open late without warning, a surprise swap of guards and routes. These are not cinematic flourishes, but practical steps that saved cargo and lives. Before the story flows toward the grand 1741 defense, the earlier sack of 1697 deserves a fuller, humane picture. French officers and buccaneers, partners made by opportunity rather than affection, landed, advanced, and found the richest parts of the city, soft, where money slept. The attack wounded not only buildings, but trust. Families that had saved for generations saw their paper and plate vanish. Churches counted missing items and wrote down their loss as calmly as they could. Refugees, even temporary ones, change a city's rhythm. In the rebuilding, new lines appeared on architectural drawings. More guns faced out to sea, more loopholed walls faced inland streets. More plans included provisions for flooding approaches and denying attackers firm ground. Citizens learned to hold their property differently, with diversification that sounds modern but feels old. Less in one place, more in several, less in obvious objects, more in instruments of credit. That is how pain teaches policy. Now the great siege returns with soft footsteps, and the camera glides back to 1741. To a city measured against an armada. Names belong here because they anchor memory. The British Admiral Edward Vernon, the Spanish defense shaped by a talented commander and a viceroy who worked in tandem, and by officers who knew the heat, the swamp, the short rains that rinsed sweat and then made the air heavier. The phases are simple to follow. First, naval bombardments to test the outer works, then landings on Tierra Bamba to establish batteries, then the forcing of the channel at Bocachica, like shouldering a door where someone braces it from the other side. After that, the long move toward the inner bay and the confrontation with San Felipe. D'Azizen's hand was slow but steady, supply lines lengthened, and fresh water became a precious calculation. Night movements sought surprise. Trenches crept forward like careful handwriting, ladders were carried, set, and too often abandoned. On the fortress slopes and outworks, geometry did its work. A misread trench ended in a ditch deeper than expected. A unit that thought a wall was close discovered a new angle that reopened the distance. Cannon on the heights threw iron down into the confusion. The smaller force held because it made the larger force fight in a funnel where numbers could not expand into advantage. The defeat traveled home with politicians and sailors, printed in reports that softened or sharpened details depending on who needed protection. Engineering returns, because it explains victories without raising voices. Bastions speak to each other. Hornworks take the first bite from a charge, leaving the main wall less hungry. Ravelins split approaches. Chains and booms block shortcuts. Batteries cross each other's aim. Upgrades after each crisis create a living memory in stone. Cartagena taught Spanish engineers how to translate pain into plans, and those engineers carried the lesson to other ports, a school in the open air, with cannons for chalk. The two throats, Bocachica and Boca Grande, continue their quiet duel with time. Sandbars rise and fall, channels start and end like conversations in wind. Local pilots read the water by color, texture, and the behavior of waves as they met submerged edges. Outdated charts could doom a plan, An admiral who trusted a line on paper more than a man with a lifetime of shallow water practice learned humility the hard way. Sealing one throat with obstacles forced the enemy into the other, and in that funnel an attacker could be counted, measured, and met. Over centuries, the coast helped the city the way a hill helps a fortress, by simply being where it is. Inside San Felipe again, the galleries echo with faint imagined scraping. A listener with his ear to a wooden sounder, a simple board or tube that focuses vibrations, hears a rhythm below. He signals with a knock. Others carry water buckets to a prepared chamber. A plug is removed, and a rush of water drops into a shaft with a soft roar. A sap collapses, not with a heroic blast, but with a heavy sigh of wet earth. Somewhere above, the night remains ordinary. A lantern burns in a room where a map lies open. This is underground war without drama. It is patient and almost invisible, which is why it is so effective. Counterminers did not need legends when physics was on their side. The stories of smuggling and escape are not scolded away. They are sorted. Some houses did have deep storerooms. Some convents used underground paths to move water or supplies without crossing hot streets. Cisterns connected to drains that could act like short covered ways. A few tunnels may well have linked a warehouse to a discreet loading spot where a donkey could wait out of sight while a bale was moved into shade. But the idea of a royal vault with a mile-long stone corridor descending to the sea breaks on the rocks of cost and sense. Stonework is expensive. Secrecy is fragile when dozens of laborers must dig for months. The first storm flood would turn a long sea tunnel into a pipe of sand. Legends persist because they give a city a whispering heart. In a calm voice, the verdict says yes to galleries for defense, yes to practical understreet spaces, no to the grand escape drains. Treasure lovers lean back to hear about the San Jose, the galleon that went down in 1708 off Cartagena after a battle with British ships. The image is clean: a ship, a fight, a fire, a final dive into green water. Period accounts speak of exploding powder and of cargoes that would make a modern banker sit up straight. Modern archaeology adds careful steps, mapping a debris field, identifying cannons and fittings, using depth and corrosion to estimate how much of the ship survives. Legal and ethical storms gather above such wrecks. Who owns what? How to balance a nation's heritage against the lure of cash. How to treat the sea as something more than a bank. For Cartagena's memory, the San Jose is a mirror where fascination and responsibility stare at each other. It improves the story by making viewers ask not only how much, but also what should be done with it. The work is slow, and that slowness honors both the past and the sea. Daily life within the walls deserves a kind light. The walled city held officials, merchants, and artisans. Getsemani kept the city moving with dockworkers, craftsmen, and small traders. Manga and other neighborhoods linked the port's wealth to its labor. Militia musters punctuated the month. Guilds procured rope, sailcloth, barrels, and tools. The Inquisition's office kept notes and routines. Hospitals and charity houses ran on donations and duty. The markets smelled of saltfish and fresh fruit. The harbor smelled of pitch and timber. Under siege, routines tightened. Water was rationed. Nights were quieter, and families slept in rooms farther from outer walls. After siege, normal life grew back like a low forest after a burn. First shoots, then shade. Cartagena's place in the wider Caribbean web was constant. Curaçao served as a conduit for Dutch trade and clever smuggling. Tortuga had already had its buccaneer season. Portobelo staged fairs that redistributed the wealth of continents. Havana received fleets like a mother port and armed them like a father. Letters of marque turned private ships into legal raiders under a flag. But legality changed with politics and the distance between capitals and colonies. A privateer with a letter in one port became a pirate in another. If a governor read the world differently, regional actors watched Cartagena's calendar, timing raids for moments of convoy concentration or repair seasons when ships lay in pieces on the shore. waiting for new planks. Money teaches patience even to the impatient. How to break a fortress city is not a secret, and the explanation is friendly to a general ear. Sappers dig trenches toward walls, using wicker baskets filled with earth, gabions, to protect workers from musket fire. Mortars lob shells in arcs over walls to harass defenders or set fires. Batteries of cannon pound a chosen spot until stone and morale crack. Ladders go up, men follow, and the attempt is called an escalade. Disease does not care about plans. It attacks both sides, but often finds the larger army easier to feed on, because more men mean more waste, less clean water, and longer lines of supply where food turns and medicine thins. Weather plays referee. Heat slows assault and defense alike. Rain ruins powder and softens trenches. Sudden winds scatter ships at anchor. The toolbox is simple. The outcomes are complicated, because nature and human endurance sit beside courage and cannon. Intelligence work held the threads together. Harbor lookouts, red flag signals from outer posts. False flags tempted enemies into misreading identity and distance. Prisoners were questioned with promises, threats, and careful listening for slips. Governors and captains exchanged information in loops that could clog if messengers were diverted, or if a courier chose the wrong road at the wrong hour. Deserters became wild cards, sometimes misleading, sometimes revealing the one detail an officer needed to change a plan in time. In one siege after another, information solved problems before soldiers did. Maps misreadings, and the sandbar problem produced some of the era's most quietly costly mistakes. An admiral who trusted a chart made in a different season found his ship stuck where water had been deep last year. A pilot who knew that a line of darker water meant a sudden shelf of sand saved an entire landing by choosing a longer path into the bay. Sandbars and shoals behave like shifting minefields. They did not explode, but they did what mines do. They restricted movement, slowed momentum, and forced predictable paths into fields of fire. Charts had to be updated by eyes, which meant that humble local expertise could weigh more than imported prestige. Movie beats now take their turn and yield gracefully to reality. Instant tunnel getaways, followed by a flourish on a quay, make fine spectacle. The real underground was mostly listening, flooding, and controlled explosions in tight places where a man crawled on knees and elbows. The idea of all gold galleons floating like treasure chests ignores the mixed cargoes that made the convoy system resilient. Wood, food, textiles, and coin all together made a moving market. Silent night escalades looked spectacular on screen. In truth, ladders clattered, men breathed hard, and defenders shouted warnings, while drums and bells carried sound across stone. The friendly point is this: reality does not shrink the wonder. It changes its shape. The city's defenses were smarter than a chase scene, and the treasure system was stronger than a single chest. How do we know these things? Evidence falls into easy buckets. Spanish engineering reports describe bastions, ravelins, and galleries in practical language without poetry, which is a sign of professionals talking to professionals. Muster rolls list names and pay so that a governor could not invent soldiers after the fact. Treasury ledgers record weights and seals with a precision that would crave a calculator if the century had owned one. French and English logs offer their own angles, sometimes bitter, sometimes proud, on assaults and retreats. Travelers' accounts, honest and embroidered, add street color and smell. Modern archaeology brings instruments to bear on old dirt and old wood, while coastal geomorphology, the study of how coasts change, explains Boca Chica and Boca Grande without drama. A viewer does not need to become a specialist to trust the line. The combined weight of these sources points in the same direction. A verdict framework is just a clean table in the mind. Criteria include strategic choke points, adaptive engineering, convoy economics, underground defense realities, and the persistence of legend. Each siege teaches something. Drake shows how a quick strike forces defensive growth. Poitiers shows how civic trauma reshapes both walls and attitudes. Vernon teaches how numbers fail when they meet geometry, heat, and disease. Treasure logistics reveal the strength of paper and procedure under stress. Tunnels prove that stone ears matter as much as stone fists. Legends persist because they are good company after dinner. The answer, delivered gently, distills a long night. Cartagena survived because it turned the bay into a fortress as much as the walls. It used countermine galleries, not as grand secret highways, but as listening and striking spaces inside the hill. It tightened the paper and escort system around treasure, so that ships moved as herds, not as isolated meals for wolves. The likely legends remain just that, pleasant stories about long escape tunnels and hidden sea door. The documented truth sits in bastions, batteries, chains, and galleries, whose lines still cast cool shade. The city's story still governs how people imagine Caribbean treasure ports, because it blends theater and paperwork, canon and calendar, stone and sound. A lightning round clears the last clouds. Were there mile-long escape tunnels to the open sea? No. Short galleries and service passages existed, but the grand tubes are legend. Did galleons sail stuffed only with gold? No. Convoys carried mixed cargoes that made the empire run. Could a single night assault take San Felipe? Unlikely. Defenders designed outworks to break momentum, and night favored the knowledge of those who built the hill. Did Boca Grande always admit warships? No. Sandbars often kept heavy hulls out. Were buccaneers the same as pirates? Buccaneers began as hunters and privateers. Many slid into piracy as papers lapsed and prophets called. Did disease matter more than cannon? Often yes. Fevers and dysentery thinned ranks faster than shot. Did governors secretly profit from smuggling? Some did. The line between corruption and necessity was thinner than anyone likes to admit. Was every vault buried underground? No. Much wealth was secured by paper guard and timing rather than by burying metal. Those who want more can follow friendly paths. Fortress engineering studies of Cartagena explain walls without formulas. Convoy and treasury records show how an empire moved value from mine to market. Siege diaries reveal fear and routine in equal measure. Regional archaeology on coastal forts and galleries adds proof written in soil. Responsible museum pages and academic overviews collect these strands in accessible language. The night eases toward rest with one thought held steady. Cartagena's walls were stone, but its strongest defenses were planning, patience, and the underground ears that heard enemies coming. The bay breathes like a living moat. Somewhere a watchman still imagines lanterns at Boca Chica and reads the wind with a slow smile. A next episode can sail to Portobello, the market that fed the galleons, but tonight the image can settle on a calm sheet of water reflecting bastions that have watched centuries pass and still understand their work. The story resumes with the great siege still unfolding, and the listener already knows the outlines. A giant fleet pressing forward, a smaller city drawing breath and answering with stone, earth and patience. Now the lens narrows to a few quiet moments that decide big outcomes. On a humid night when breath feels heavy, columns of assault troops move toward the slopes of San Felipe, ladders carried by tired arms, drums kept silent by strict orders. The men step into trenches they did not expect to be so deep. The ladders feel heavier than before. Some reach the base of the inner works and realize in those few seconds that the measurements on paper did not survive contact with rock. A ladder tilted up meets stone and falls an arm's length short. In the confusion of darkness, carrying extra length is not easy. The defenders, who know every angle and every ditch, aim downward with muskets and small cannon, the kind that bite at close range. What follows is not a roar but a tug of war against gravity and fear. When the attackers fall back, they leave wood, iron, and names on the slope. The listener does not need to memorize those names to understand the pattern. Geometry and local knowledge, supported by heat and disease, turn numbers into a list of misfortunes instead of a ladder to victory. The engineering story widens. Spanish defenses in the Caribbean did not arise from guesswork. They grew from the work of military engineers who published treatises, shared drawings, and walked the sites with compasses and sticks. Italian-born specialists in Spanish service, like members of the Antonelli lineage, had helped set the regional style a century earlier by adapting European bastion theory to tropical water, heat, and hurricanes. Later engineers refined what earlier hands began. They studied how coral stone absorbed shot, how earth in front of a wall swallowed the energy of a cannonball better than bare masonry, how ditches made at a low angle forced an attacker to step down first and climb up later under fire. After each crisis at Cartagena, lines on paper shifted. The thickness of a curtain wall might be increased, the face of a bastion shortened to improve crossfire, a ravelin added to block a straight approach, a hornwork extended like a cautious handshake to meet an enemy a little farther from home. The city became a living notebook, where errors wrote notes to future defenders and successes were copied cleanly into new pages. The bay's twin throats continued to matter. Boca Chica, narrow and honest, was easier to control and easier to understand. Boca Grande, with sand that moved as if it had opinions, demanded pilots who watched water like a living text. Shifting shoals forced heavy ships to either risk grounding or accept a longer path that invited every battery in the harbor to practice its aim. Over decades, storms rearranged the shallow contours, closing one channel, reopening another, and making last year's perfect sketch a dangerous guide. Shore beacons mattered, but so did the color of the water at noon. The way wind pushed chop across a flat, the sudden whirl of a line cast from a boat that told a pilot the bottom had risen. Those pilots, often anonymous, stood between victory and disaster more than once, and their memory lived in families who passed down local knowledge as carefully as a chart. Underground. A scene unfolds so quiet, it could almost be missed. In a low gallery under San Felipe, men set a wooden sounder against packed earth and listen. The tool is simple, a board or tube that carries vibrations from soil to ear. On a good night, the underground is silent, except for the small sounds a fortress makes when it relaxes. On riskier nights, a faint rhythm appears. Scrape, pause, scrape, the telltale sign of sappers moving forward, under cover. The counterminers do not rush. They measure. One man marks a wall with chalk. Another advances a few feet into a side branch and listens again. A third prepares a small chamber, tamping earth around a bag of powder with care that comes from experience. When the enemy is close enough, a fuse whispers into life. The result is local and precise. A rush of air, a dump of dirt, a collapse, where a tunnel met resistance it never saw. Sometimes water does the work, poured down a shaft in the defender's gallery to flood an attacker's sap, like a storm, fills a basement. Everything about the scene is small. The tools, the rooms, the moments. Everything about the effect is large. A day's work disappears. A plan breaks. An assault loses a tooth. The reality outperforms the legend because it is repeatable and reliable. Above ground, the treasure system that made Cartagena a target hums along with routines built to withstand surprises. The convoy scheme had two main branches: the fleet of New Spain, touching Veracruz among other ports, and the Tierra Firme fleet, tied to the Isthmus and the South American interior. Both gathered under seasonal winds and sailed together when they could. The idea was simple enough for a child to grasp. A herd is safer than a lone animal. At Cartagena, cargoes were registered and guarded with procedural pride. Seals closed boxes. Officers signed ledgers that listed weights, stamps, origins, and destinations. Relays of soldiers walked routes with rhythms designed to be predictable for the honest and hard to exploit for the dishonest. When danger rose, emergency plans scattered high-value items into several secure places within the walls instead of piling them under one roof. The old wisdom that never puts all eggs in a single basket. Precious stones required other layers of discipline. Emeralds, often from celebrated mines in New Granada such as Muzo and Chivor, needed careful examination and paperwork that traveled with them like a passport. Fraud existed. Countermeasures existed too. The balance was never perfect, but the sentence the city wrote with paper, boxes, and schedules was clear: theft would require brains, not just bravery. The wider Caribbean adds a chorus. Curacao supplied contraband, and credit with Dutch neatness. Jamaica with a changing heart from Port Royal to Kingston fed legal and illegal engines. Tortuga had already given Europe a long story about hunters turned sea raiders. Portobello's fairs, heavy with silver and expectation, organized a rhythm that pirates learned to dance around. Letters of marque, the documents that made privateers legal in one season, expired when treaties were signed, and then sometimes reappeared with the next war's first trumpet. A privateer of 1 month could be a pirate in another if his letter went unrecognized in a distant port. Governors accommodated or resisted depending on their budgets and their walls. Smugglers studied calendars. The web of money, paper, and wind stretched from the Spanish Main to London, counting houses and Paris salons. And Cartagena sat at a knot in that web. Every tug on that knot made a sound that a careful listener can still hear. The shift of policy, the scrape of a quill, the creak of a block as a sail filled. To return to the 1697 sack with human detail is to witness how cities heal. After the foreign flags were gone and the fires were tucked into memory, the people of Cartagena did not rebuild on the exact lines they had used before. They widened certain streets to serve as fire breaks. They opened spaces near key bastions so that artillery had clear fields. They reinforced warehouses and moved the most sensitive registries to rooms with thicker walls and fewer doors. Families who had concentrated wealth into obvious objects, silver services, ornate furniture, paintings, easy to identify and steal, learned to hold value in less visible forms. Credit notes, shares in cargo, obligations written in a book and enforceable with law instead of sword. The city's culture adjusted in calm ways. Feast days gained layers of thanksgiving for survival. Processions walked near walls that offered shade and symbolism at once. Militia drills grew sharper because drill is the rehearsal that turns panic into choreography when a bell rings at the wrong hour. The great siege's ripple effect outside Cartagena becomes clearer with distance. In Britain, public expectations had been stoked by earlier, smaller successes. The massive expedition sent to the city felt like the crown of a campaign, and was advertised that way in coffeehouses and newspapers. When it failed, accounts had to be written with care. Some emphasized disease, an argument that had the advantage of being true. Others emphasized bad intelligence, too short ladders and tactical missteps. All true in part. Many avoided praising the defenders, which would have tasted like defeat on the tongue. In Spain and New Granada, the defense was celebrated quietly, in administrative language and loudly in local pride. Careers rose and fell with the telling. Across the Atlantic world, watchers took a lesson that still holds. Colonial fortresses, when well led and well maintained, could repulse enormous expeditionary forces if time, climate, and terrain were read correctly. A pause for clear, friendly explanations helps retain detail without turning the ear tired. Bastion geometry is like two friends watching each other's blind spots. A hornwork is a small projection that forces an attacker to go around a problem while eating fire from the sides. A ravelin is a triangle in front of a wall that splits an enemy's approach and blocks direct cannon fire against the main masonry. Chains or booms across a channel are not magic. They are speed bumps that give artillery more time to think. An interlocking battery network is simply a neighborhood watch where every window looks onto the same street. When these simple ideas work together, an enemy feels uncomfortable long before he reaches the front door. The San Jose returns not as a pile of gold, but as a place where ethics and curiosity meet. Period accounts speak of its end with a mix of awe and sadness. The cargo lists, even when incomplete, suggest wealth dense enough to change balances in distant capitals. Modern exploration brings tools that neither century could imagine: remote imaging, careful photography, and sample analysis that turns a small fragment into a data-rich object. Arguments about ownership and purpose are not distractions. They are the adult conversation that wealth demands. National heritage weighs against commercial interest. The rights of those who died weigh against the needs of museums and classrooms that educate the living. For Cartagena, the wreck is a chapter it did choose to write, but must read carefully. The city gains patience from this. It knows the sea will not give up all its secrets fast, and it has learned that slowness honors both the dead and the knowledge that might yet be gathered. An easy walk through a day inside the walls puts a human face on stone. Before sunrise, bells sound from churches, and a long line of silhouettes appears on the ramparts as the night watch hands over to the morning guard. Market women arrive with baskets balanced like small boats on their heads. An apprentice cooper checks staves in a barrel he hopes to sell by noon. A sailor on leave looks for a cobbler who can fix a boot before his ship weighs anchor. At the Caja Real, a scribe shakes sand from a freshly dried page and ties a bundle of ledgers with twine. In Getsamani, a wharf worker pushes a cart of rope through a doorway already darkened by the day's sun beyond it. A militia sergeant inspects muskets with the simple standard that saves lives: no rust, clean touch holes, flints sharp. Children run past walls older than their grandparents, playing games that need only space and laughter. Under siege, these scenes change tempo but not direction. Water carriers work longer routes. The sergeant tightens the line. The scribe writes shorter entries because the day contains more interruptions. After siege, the market laughs louder than before, as if sound itself is a defiant banner. Intelligence at Cartagena is a story of ears, eyes, and quiet favors. A fisherman, who knows how currents turn at night, notices a group of boats hugging a line he has never seen, used that way. He mentions it to a cousin in the militia. A tailor who repairs a small tear in a visiting officer's coat finds a local map in a pocket, drawn with more confidence than a tourist's sketch. He tells a neighbor who knows someone in the governor's office. A deserter wanders to a church and sits down in the shade before deciding whether to trade his story for safety. A harbor signal mast changes flags in a practiced sequence that a lookout on La Popa echoes with a smaller set of colors. None of this makes good theater. All of it makes strong defense. Counterintelligence is the same woven fabric in reverse. A rumor seeded here. A brace of barrels moved to a different dock to confuse a spy there. A governor's letter that mentions a date that will be amended later by design. This is not trickery for its own sake. It is the part of war that keeps sword and cannon from doing more than they must. Maps and misreadings contain a quiet caution that reaches beyond Cartagena. Ambition loves a clean diagram. A map with crisp ink lines makes a problem appear solved if those lines are believed too much. The sandbar problem is the correction written by nature. Wind pushes water against a slope and moves grains along the floor of a channel. River outflow after rain lays a fan of silt where the bay narrows. Late in the season, storms carve a new snag that grabs keels in a place no one expected. Local pilots track all this the way a baker tracks the rise and fall of dough in a warm kitchen. An admiral who treats a pilot kindly, gives him room to speak, and follows his advice will always be wiser than one who treats a paper chart like a promise. In 1741, cases of grounding, halting, and reforming took crucial time from an army that had wanted to surprise and overwhelm. Every hour given to a defender is interest paid on a loan the attacker cannot afford. The popular image of tunnels whispers again at the edge of the narrative, and geology provides a friendly answer. Cartagena sits on coastal ground where coral limestone and compacted sediments play a role in what people can safely dig. Long, unsupported tunnels in such ground invite collapse, especially near a bay where water pressure and tides worry the edges. Even if a wealthy patron could hire 100 workers in secret, an unlikely task in a city where gossip runs faster than horses. The first heavy rain might fill the lower sections with sand and ruin months of work. Builders of the time knew how to make arches over short spans. They did not have magic that defeats physics over long ones. By contrast, short service corridors and defensive galleries are more than possible. They are sensible. They turn small resources into large advantages and require maintenance a small team can perform between a bell and a prayer. Now the narrative turns for a moment to the human edges of military action. Disease, weather, and supplies, because these are the three old judges that sat over the 1741 siege and stamped their approval on the defense. Fevers bred mosquitoes in low ground and hit newcomers hardest. Dysentery followed bad water with its own signature. thinning ranks and dampening the spirit of men who could swim a mile, but could not walk 100 feet without discomfort. Rain, when it fell, washed gunpowder from cartridges and forced men to protect charges under coats and in barrels of sand. Sun made iron hot enough to burn bare hands and pushed soldiers to the edge of patience before noon. Supply lines ran across beaches and along narrow paths, where a single cannon shot could knock down a day's plan like a stick house in wind. The defenders, behind shorter lines and with more secure water sources, learned how to keep these judges at least neutral, if not friendly. The attackers, far from their base and dependent on moving a floating city, stood in a courtroom with a biased bench. Cultural life under pressure deserves a small window of its own, because it shows resilience in ordinary clothes. During a lull in bombardment, a group of neighbors finishes a short prayer together and then shares water and a few slices of fruit like a quiet feast. A musician mends a broken string on a fiddle with a piece of fine thread and plays a steady tune that does not travel far. Out of respect for the hour, a small procession delivers a meal to soldiers on a bastion and leaves a flower on a parapet where a friend had stood the day before. These are not dramatic scenes. They are the warmth that keeps a city human when stone and iron threaten to make it all wall and no heart. When the guns fall silent for good, these are the habits that return first and tell everyone that life has won. More myths yield to careful light. The idea that every governor fattened his purse with smuggling has the advantage of being fun to say, and the disadvantage of being lazy to think. Some governors accepted favors for blind eyes. Others fought contraband with a zeal that made enemies among local merchants. Many, most likely, lived between those poles, granting exceptions when policy from far capitals did not match the needs on the ground, tightening rules when abuse lowered dignity or security. The line between corruption and practical governance in the colonial world was a blurred shore, and Cartagena was no exception. The point for the listener is modest and useful. Judge people in context and do not let a single easy word erase the work of many who kept books straight and watches steady. A few well-chosen moments from the film world return to close loops in friendly fashion. Tunnels that cough up heroes under a full moon exist because stories need acceleration. Real galleries move slower and save lives in the dark. Treasure piled in mounds high as a man's shoulder looks fine on a screen. Real value, dense and small, hides in crates, in sealed jars, in leather bags under lock and ledger, and even in documents that say who owns what in Spanish, that a clerk would say twice before writing once. Night assaults that feel like whispers on wind in movies become scenes of panting men, scrapes on wood, clanks on stone, and shouted orders that echo back wrong the first time and must be repeated. Ships that seem to dance between rocks on command carry the hidden labor of pilots who lived on water long enough to read it like a hand. The reality is not less beautiful. It is beautiful in a way that lingers after the lights come up. As the script moves toward its final stretch, a slow recapitulation keeps the mind organized without turning the voice into a list. The map is clear. The walled city with its bastions and curtains, Gethsemane humming with labor, San Felipe ruling a hill, La Popa watching like a patient older friend, Boca Chica and Boca Grande acting as doors that can be opened or shut, and batteries on Tierra Bomba joining hands across water. The treasure circuit is clear. Mines to fairs, fairs to warehouses, warehouses to convoys, convoys to Havana, Havana to Spain, with emeralds glinting among the crates and ledgers woven around it all. The assaults are clear. Drake's ransom as a lesson, Pointus's sack as a wound that healed into stronger skin, Vernon's armada as a mirror that made Europe reconsider force and made Cartagena trust its geometry. The tunnels are clear. Countermine galleries that listen and bite, practical short passages that serve commerce, legends long enough to be entertaining and fortunately soft enough to dismiss without cruelty. The verdict is clear. The bay as a fortress equal to the walls, stone and paper as partners, patience and planning as the city's strongest soldiers. For those who enjoy the brief certainty of quick answers, one more short round offers crisp sentences to carry away. Could a hidden tunnel network under the bay have allowed a whole garrison to escape? No, the physics and labor demands make it a fable. Did galleons sometimes sail with cargoes so rich that a single capture could ruin a finance minister's week? Yes, but those cargoes included coin plus valuable goods, and dispersion and escort reduced risk. Could San Felipe have been taken by surprise if ladders had fit perfectly? Possibly a foothold could be won, but outworks and interior lines still favored defenders who knew the ground. Was Boca Grande ever a simple path to the inner bay? Sometimes channels allowed small craft, but heavy warships feared the sand and the guns that watched over it. Were buccaneers just pirates with better publicity? They began as hunters and often shifted to legal raiding before many crossed into outright piracy. The borders mattered in courts even if they blurred in markets. Did disease truly tilt battles? Very often, illness weakens the arms that carry ladders, loads guns, and rows boats. Did governors always play fair with contraband? Not always, but painting them all as villains misses the reality that some fought corruption with real courage. Was treasure usually locked underground? No. Safety came from paperwork, armed escorts, and timing more than from burying metal in dark rooms. A gentle pointer on learning more keeps the door open without turning the viewer into a student with homework. Fortress studies explain why walls look the way they do in a voice almost anyone can follow. Treasury records show the empire as a network of rooms, seals, and signatures. Siege diaries whisper the day-to-day truth. Rain on powder, misheard orders, small kindnesses, and grit. Archaeology demonstrates how careful hands and tools can read soil like a book. Museums put it all in sequence so minds can stroll from map to model and leave with a story that makes sense. At last, the script closes the circle and brings the harbor back into view at night. The listener now knows that Cartagena's survival was not a single miracle, but a series of correct choices made in heat and worry. It was planning written on stone. It was patience in galleries under a hill where men listened to the earth and decided calmly where to touch it with water or fire. It was a bay treated like a fortress, where sandbars and channels were weapons that needed gardeners rather than guards. It was paper and escort, ledgers and seals, not as dull details but as smart shields around value that would otherwise have made bullseyes out of every church and home. This understanding is not loud. It is satisfying in the way a well-made lock is satisfying when it turns. Cartagena's walls were stone, but its strongest defenses were planning, patience, and the underground ears that heard enemies coming. The bay breathes under a soft sky. Somewhere a pilot, eyes half closed, names the colors of water he has known since childhood. Somewhere a clerk closes a ledger with a string and a knot he could tie in the dark. Somewhere a child sleeps within the walls and dreams of ships as quiet as clouds. The story of the siege, the gold and the hidden tunnels, settles into that same calm. The listener can hold it without strain. A city that learned, a harbor that helped, and a people who refused to be hurt.